Picture this. It's the 1930s, and two nations are heading to war over a huge, desolate piece of South American wilderness called the Grand Chaco. It was a brutal, bloody conflict for sure, but the thing that really decided the war, well, it wasn't the number of soldiers or tanks. It was a secret weapon, a map. But not a map drawn with ink. Oh no, this was a map written into the land itself, a code that only a very select few could actually read. And this is really the core mystery of the Chaco War. On the one hand, you've got the official maps from that time. All clean lines, clearly defined rivers, and neat little borders. You know, a picture of order and control. But then on the other hand, you have the reality on the ground. A featureless, hostile landscape that the soldiers literally called the Green Hell. This was a place that seemed to actively fight back against being mapped. So that begs a pretty big question, right? How could the maps be so unbelievably wrong? I mean, how could two modern armies fight a war over a territory that, for all intents and purposes, didn't really exist on paper? The whole thing was a complete cartographic illusion. And look, the problem wasn't just that the maps were a little inaccurate. They were a total mirage. They showed a static, predictable world that had absolutely no resemblance to the reality, a reality that was constantly changing, and one that was incredibly hostile to the soldiers who were trapped inside it. In the Chaco, the ground itself was a lie. It was a constantly shifting landscape with zero trustworthy reference points. Now, for an army, this is way more than just a logistical nightmare. It's an existential crisis. I mean, how do you plan an attack, or secure a supply line, or even just find your way back to your own base when you can't even trust the earth beneath your feet? Okay, so you might be wondering, well, why couldn't they just, make better maps? What was it about the Chaco that made it so unique that the standard surveying techniques, the very methods that were used to map entire continents, failed so completely? Well, military mapmaking really depends on a technique called triangulation. What surveyors do is they use fixed points, like mountain peaks, to create a whole network of super accurate measurements. But the Chaco, it offered nothing fixed. It was this giant flat plain with no peaks to speak of. Its rivers would just show up during massive floods and then completely vanish into dust during the dry season. The entire landscape was in constant motion, which meant any measurement they took was pretty much useless almost as soon as they wrote it down. This quote just perfectly captures the whole problem. The surveyors were trying to apply the rigid, predictable logic of mathematics to a landscape that was behaving more like a living thing, dynamic, fluid, and completely unpredictable. It was an impossible task. It was like trying to measure a ghost. The conclusion here was pretty stark and unavoidable. The established methods weren't just not good enough, they were completely useless. The very tools of cartography that had helped build entire empires were totally defeated by this one patch of hostile Earth. If this war was going to be won, they needed a radically new way of thinking. And this is where our story takes a really fascinating turn. With the military mapmakers completely stumped, a totally unexpected group of experts stepped in. Naturalists. These were scientists who saw the Chaco not as a bunch of points and lines on a page, but as a living, breathing system. They brought a radical new idea to the table called ecological analysis. So, instead of looking for static mountains and rivers, they started looking at the dynamic, living systems of the land itself. The plants, the soil, all the subtle clues that told the real story of the terrain. Their method was kind of like forensic science, but for the landscape. First, they'd identify and map out where all the different plant species were growing. Then, they analyzed the soil, and they started linking specific types of plants to specific types of soil. And this allowed them to predict the location of the single most critical resource in the Chaco, water. They weren't just observing the ecosystem, they were decoding it. The real breakthrough was this realization that the vegetation wasn't random at all. It was a language. Each plant told a story. A certain kind of tree only grew in clay soil. A specific type of scrub meant there was groundwater close to the surface. By learning to read this language, the naturalists could suddenly see what the surveyors couldn't. The vegetation itself, it became the map. Now, this scientific insight wasn't just some cool academic exercise. In the middle of a brutal war, this brand new way of reading the land became an incredibly powerful strategic advantage. And this really highlights the two fundamentally different ways of seeing things. The surveyor, he looked for static lines and points, and all he saw was a blank, featureless void. But the naturalist, they looked for living systems and patterns, and they saw a rich, detailed story that revealed all the secrets of the terrain. This gets right to the heart of it. The key to unlocking the Chaco wasn't about forcing a man-made map onto the land. It was about learning to read the map the land had already written for itself, a map drawn not with ink, but with seeds. All of a sudden, fields like botany and ecology were no longer just for academics. They became powerful tools of war. The ability to read the landscape, to know where to find water, to know where the ground was stable, and to know where an army could actually advance, that became the ultimate strategic advantage. And this leaves us with a pretty provocative thought to chew on. If a territory can be read through its vegetation, does that change how we define our world? What happens to the whole idea of a border when it's no longer just a line on a map, but a living, growing thing? The story of the Chaco suggests that sometimes the most important lines are the ones drawn by nature itself. Thanks for watching.